Lena worked quietly in the Arlington house, every morning before the sun rose. She tied her hair back, slipped on her plain uniform, and stepped into the grand hallway with its shining marble floors. The Arlington family was rich, very rich. The kind of rich that didn't notice the people who served them. To them, Lena was just the maid, someone who dusted the picture frames, folded the towels just right, and stayed silent unless spoken to. She had been working there for nearly a year. No one asked where she came from. No one knew what she liked, or if she had any dreams. And Lena never offered that part of herself to them. She just worked, day in and day out, and when the sun went down and the halls were quiet again, she returned to the tiny room at the back of the mansion, behind the kitchen. There was a grand piano in the main hall. It stood there like a piece of art, polished, untouched, and silent. Lena passed by it every day while dusting or vacuuming. Her fingers would sometimes brush against the smooth keys when no one was looking. Not enough to play, just enough to remember. Because long before she ever wore a maid's uniform, Lena had once touched a different world, a world of music. She had loved music as a child. Her mother worked 2 jobs, but always saved enough to pay for a small music class at the community center. The piano there was old and out of tune, but Lena didn't care. She played with joy, with hope, with everything inside her. Her teacher once told her she had the kind of hands that could make a stone cry. But life didn't care about hands or music when bills piled up. When her mother got sick, everything changed. Lena had to drop out of her classes. She worked late in diners, folded laundry for neighbors, and eventually found work as a housemaid. It wasn't a dream, but it was a way to survive, and in her apron pocket, she kept one folded piece of sheet music. It was old and creased, but she never let it go. It reminded her of who she was, or who she used to be. At the mansion, the Arlington family never noticed the way Lena looked at the piano. They threw parties often, loud, flashy, filled with people talking about money and vacations, but none of them ever played that piano. It was just decoration, a thing to be admired but never touched to Lena. It was something else. It was a ghost of the life she had left behind, and sometimes, when the hall was empty, she would sit at the bench for just a moment. Not to play, just to sit, and imagine one day. The house was buzzing with activity. A big party was being prepared. Caterers ran through the halls, decorators hung lights and ribbons, and the staff moved quickly to make everything perfect. Lena worked harder than ever, polishing, carrying, and helping set up the grand room. She overheard that a well-known pianist was scheduled to play during the event. Her heart fluttered a little when she heard that. It had been so long since she heard live music. Maybe, just maybe, she'd get to hear something that would remind her of home. That night, the mansion was full of laughter and perfume. Lena stayed out of sight, serving drinks and clearing plates. She didn't look people in the eye. Maids weren't supposed to. She didn't speak unless needed. The piano stood in the center of the room, polished and waiting. But as the hour came for the performance, something unexpected happened. The pianist had canceled. Got caught in the storm, they said. Mr. and Mrs. Arlington looked stressed, whispering sharply to each other. The guests were starting to get bored. The music had stopped, and now all that remained was awkward silence and the clink of glasses. Lena stood at the back of the room, watching. She looked at the piano, then at the restless guests. Her fingers twitched, almost like they were remembering the keys on their own. She took one step forward, then another. Her heart beat fast, her mouth dry. She didn't plan to speak, but suddenly she heard herself say, "If you'd like, I can play." The room turned slowly toward her. A maid, playing for the guests? Mrs. Arlington raised an eyebrow. A few guests laughed under their breath, but no one stopped her, and Lena, small, quiet, and almost invisible all her life, walked toward the piano. Not one person knew what was about to happen, not even Lena. All she knew was that the first note was ready. It had been waiting inside her for years, and now, finally, it was time to let it breathe. Lena sat down on the piano bench slowly. The room was still, the kind of stillness that comes right before something important happens. She didn't look at anyone, didn't search for approval. Her eyes were fixed on the keys, her hands resting gently above them. The laughter from before had faded. The guests leaned in, some with smirks, some with raised brows, others just curious. A maid? Playing at their party? It was almost funny until she touched the first key. It was soft, not loud or showy, just one clear, warm note. And it seemed to cut through the air like a whisper in a crowded room. Something about that single note made a few people stop. Chewing made someone set their glass down without thinking. Then came the second note, then the third, and before they knew it, the music had taken over the space like light flooding through an open window. Lena's hands moved with memory, not effort. She wasn't performing, she was remembering. Every key told a piece of her life. The quiet mornings, the heavy nights, the dreams that never had time to grow. Her fingers floated, paused, pressed, held, and the sound that came out wasn't perfect like a recording. It was human, real, raw, full of emotion and honesty. Mrs. Arlington stood frozen near the fireplace, her lips slightly parted. Mr. Arlington, who never sat during parties, slowly sank into a chair. No one spoke. Even the servers in the back stopped walking. It wasn't just music anymore. It was a story, and they were all inside it. Lena didn't play something fancy or famous. She played the song she had kept folded in her apron all these years. The notes had lived in her for so long that they came out like breath, not forced, just needed. And as she played, she forgot where she was. She wasn't in a mansion, in front of rich guests. She was a little girl again in a small room with cracked walls. Her mother humming, her fingers learning, her heart wide open. A few guests began blinking faster. Not from the lights. One woman dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Someone else leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked on Lena's hands. No. One laughed now. No one moved, because in those few minutes, the walls between rich and poor, maid and guest, just disappeared. And for the first time in a long time, Lena felt seen, not for how clean her work was, not for how quiet she could be, but for something that belonged only to her, something she hadn't shared with anyone in years. Her music, her voice, her truth. The last note hung in the air like a candle flicker right before going out. And then, nothing, no clapping, no whispering, just silence, heavy and full. Lena stood up slowly, unsure of what would come next. Had she made a mistake? Should she have stayed in the shadows like always? But just as she turned to step away from the piano, someone stood up, then another, and then applause. Not polite, not forced. It started small, then grew, wave after wave. It wasn't just clapping. It was something else, release maybe, or respect. Lena didn't know how to respond. She bowed her head slightly, gave a small smile, and walked toward the kitchen. She didn't look back. Her hands were still shaking, but her heart felt light, like she had left something on those keys that didn't belong to her anymore. Something she had carried too long alone, inside the kitchen. The other workers looked at her like she'd just turned into someone else. One older cook whispered, "That was you?" Lena only nodded and quietly went to pour herself a glass of water. Her hands still trembled, but her chest was calm. For the first time in years, she felt like something had started to change. Back in the main room, the Arlingtons were still standing near the piano. Their guests talked in soft voices, some asking who the girl was, some still wiping their eyes. No one talked about the canceled pianist anymore. They only talked about the maid who played like she was born for it. And Mr. Arlington, who usually never remembered staff names, asked one simple question: "What's her name again?" Lena didn't sleep much that night. Not because she was worried, but because her heart was too full. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the music again. The soft clapping, the quiet hush that filled the hall after the final note. It wasn't just applause, it was something more, something that told her, "You matter." The next morning, she returned to her usual routine. She folded sheets, wiped down counters, and helped serve breakfast to the Arlington family. No one said anything at first. It felt like everything had returned to normal. But when Mr. Arlington stood from the table, he looked directly at her. "Lena," he said, "you were remarkable." She didn't know how to respond. A thank you? A bow? Instead, she simply nodded, her cheeks warm, and returned to the kitchen. There, the other maids and staff looked at her differently. Not with jealousy, not with awe, but with quiet pride. They had watched her carry heavy trays, scrub floors, and stay up late folding laundry. Now they had seen another side of her, a side that had been hidden for too long. Later that day, a letter arrived at the house. It was addressed to Miss Lena, piano performer. No one had ever written her name like that before. Inside was an invitation to perform at a small local event, a community night at a nearby theater. They had heard about her from a guest at the charity event. "We'd be honored if you'd consider playing for us," the note said. Lena stared at the letter for a long time. She'd never been invited to anything like that. Not as a guest, not as talent. She took a deep breath, folded the letter, and tucked it beside her old sheet music. She didn't say yes right away. But she didn't say no either. That evening, while she was sweeping the hallway, Mrs. Arlington stopped her. "There's a man asking for you," she said softly. Lena's heart skipped. Not many people ever came for her. She stepped outside and saw a man in a gray coat holding a small black case. "I'm a music teacher," he said, introducing himself politely. "I was in the audience last night. I haven't heard something that honest in years." He smiled gently, not like someone talking to a maid, but to an equal. "I run a local program for young musicians. We don't have much, but we do real work. I was wondering, would you come by, maybe just talk to the students? Play for them, if you'd like?" Lena stood there in silence for a moment. She hadn't taught anyone before. She wasn't sure she even knew how to explain what she did. But the idea of sharing her story with kids like she once was, it felt right. "I'll think about it," she said, and the teacher gave her his card and nodded. No pressure. Just know, they'd learn more from one song from you than 10 from anyone else. That night, Lena sat by the window in her room, watching the sky change from gold to soft gray. She held the old sheet music in her hand again. The edges were more worn now, but she didn't care. It had stayed with her this long. She wasn't going to let go of it now. She thought about her mother, about the times they'd sit in their tiny apartment while she practiced. Her mother would hum, not always in tune, but always with love. She used to say, "Music doesn't ask for perfect. It just asks for true." And Lena finally understood what that meant. Over the next few days, more notes and messages came. Small event organizers, a few piano lovers, even a local journalist who had heard about the Maid with the Melody. She never asked for any of this. It just came to her, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to bloom. But even with all the attention, Lena stayed the same. She still helped in the kitchen, still folded napkins with care. She didn't walk with pride, just quiet peace. Because she knew now that what made her special wasn't fame or talent. It was the courage to play that first note when everyone else expected her to stay silent. On her day off, she visited this small music program. The room was nothing fancy. Chipped walls, old instruments, squeaky chairs. But the kids were full of energy. Eyes wide, fingers curious. When Lena sat at the beat-up piano and played a few notes, they gathered close. After the song, one small girl asked, "Were you always a musician?" Lena smiled and said, "No, I was a maid, but before that, I was a little girl who loved music, and now, I'm just someone who remembered." The room fell quiet. Even the teacher stood still, watching her with a quiet smile. And at that moment, Lena realized this wasn't about being famous. It was about being honest and maybe, just maybe, helping someone else find their own first note. After visiting the little music class, Lena walked home with a soft smile on her face. She didn't say much during the visit, but the way the children had listened to her, their eyes wide and curious, It had touched something deep inside her. She had gone there to inspire them, but somehow she felt like they had given her something instead. A kind of hope she hadn't known she needed. Back at the mansion, life continued as usual almost. She still helped in the kitchen, folded laundry, and wiped mirrors, but people treated her differently now. The staff didn't just nod anymore, they smiled. Even guests sometimes asked, "Is she the one who played?" That night, one afternoon, while she was organizing dishes in the dining room, Mr. Arlington walked in holding a stack of letters. "These came for you," he said, placing them gently on the table. Lena looked at him, confused. "I think your music's starting to travel faster than you are," he added with a small smile, then walked away. She opened the letters slowly that evening, sitting at the edge of her bed. One was from a small-town event organizer, another from a coffee house that held open mic nights. One was even from a local radio station, asking for an interview. All of them said the same thing in different ways. "We heard your story. We heard your music. Will you share it with us?" Lena didn't know how to answer right away. She wasn't used to being asked for years. Her life had been about doing what she was told, not deciding what came next. Now suddenly, she had choices, real ones. One evening, after a long day of work, she sat alone in the music room. The house was quiet, most of the guests gone. She placed her fingers gently on the piano keys, not to practice, but to think. She played slow notes, letting her mind wander. What did she want, really? Not what others expected, but what she wanted deep down. She thought about her mother. She remembered her words. "When the world feels too heavy, play your way through it." Lena closed her eyes. Maybe it was time. Not just to play, but to begin something new. The next day, she asked for a short meeting with Mr. Arlington. He welcomed her into his study, surprised but respectful. She spoke clearly, though her hands trembled in her lap. "I've received a few offers," she said. "People want me to perform. And I want to try." He nodded, listening. "I'll still help around the house." She added quickly, not wanting to sound ungrateful, but he raised a hand gently. "You've given this house something money can't buy," he said. "If you're ready to go out and share your music, do it." Lena looked at him, unsure. "You mean, leave?" "Not forever," he said, "but maybe for a while. The world needs to hear what you have to say, what you have to play." That evening, she stood in her tiny room, looking around. It had become home for her, but it wasn't where her story would end. She packed a small bag, nothing fancy, just clothes, the sheet music, and a notebook. She didn't know what the next town would bring. She didn't even know if anyone would show up to listen. But she knew one thing: she couldn't stay silent anymore. Her first performance outside the mansion was at a small community center. The room held about 50 folding chairs, a stage made of wood planks, and an old upright piano that was slightly out of tune. But Lena didn't mind. When she stepped on that stage, the audience smiled like they already knew her, and when she played, they listened with the same silence the rich had given her that night at the mansion. After the show, an older woman came up to her. "I used to play when I was a girl," she said, holding Lena's hand. "But life, you know how it goes." Lena nodded. The woman smiled, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for reminding me." That night, Lena sat by a small window in a guest room the center had offered her. She looked up at the stars and smiled softly. Her world was changing, and she was finally moving with it. Not as a maid, not as someone invisible, but as a woman with a gift, a story, and a song that still had so much more to say. Lena stood backstage at a small local theater. The lights above the curtain glowed a soft yellow, and the quiet hum of the audience filled the room like low music. It wasn't a giant concert hall. There were no cameras, no sponsors, no famous faces, but to Lena, it felt just as important as that first night at the mansion, maybe even more. This time, people came just to hear her, not because she worked there, not because they were surprised. They had seen her flyers around town, heard her name on the radio. They came because her music made them feel something. She sat at the piano slowly, fingers light on the keys, her heart beat steady, not out of fear, but out of joy. She didn't feel small anymore. She felt open, ready, like her music had finally found its place in the world. The first few notes flowed out smooth and easy. She wasn't thinking about who was watching. She wasn't thinking about how many chairs were filled. She just played. And with each note, the room grew quieter. People leaned forward, eyes soft, hearts open. Some held hands, others closed their eyes. No one spoke, no one moved too fast. They were with her, inside her story, even though not a single word had been spoken. After the performance, people clapped, not with wild cheers, but with honest warmth. It was the kind of applause that said, "Thank you for being brave, thank you for sharing something true." As Lena stepped off stage, a girl no older than 10 came running up to her. She held a small notebook and said shyly, "Can I show you my song?" Lena sat on a bench near the wall and smiled as the girl opened the book. The notes were hand-drawn, shaky but full of effort. "I don't know if it's good," the girl whispered. Lena shook her head. "If it's yours, it's already good." Later that night, Lena returned to her guest house. She poured a cup of tea and looked through the window. The town lights flickered in the distance, soft and scattered like stars. She thought about all the small places she had played these past weeks: community halls, schoolrooms, street corners. They were never big, but always full. Not full of noise, but full of feeling. She wrote letters to the children she had met. Some had dreams like hers, some just like the sound of the piano, but all of them had listened with eyes wide. And that was enough to keep her going. One evening, she received a call from someone she hadn't expected: Mr. Arlington. He asked how she was doing, if she was safe, if the music was still flowing. She smiled through the phone, grateful for the kindness in his voice. Before hanging up, he said, "We'd like to invite you back." "Back?" she asked, surprised. "There's a gala coming up. Big names, big expectations. But we thought maybe they could use something real." Lena paused for a moment, then said softly, "I'll come." When she returned to the mansion, it looked the same: tall walls, gold trim, marble floors. But this time, Lena didn't enter through the back. She walked in through the front door, her small bag in hand. Some of the staff rushed over to hug her. Others simply nodded, eyes shining. Mrs. Arlington welcomed her with a long, gentle look. "We kept the piano just as you left it," she said. Leaving her into the music room, Lena ran her fingers across the keys. And for a moment, everything felt still again. She was back where her story had changed. But now she was different. The night of the gala arrived, and the mansion was filled once more with glittering dresses and expensive shoes. But this time, the piano wasn't just decoration. This time, people waited for it to sing. When Lena stepped into the spotlight, a hush fell over the room. The same faces who once saw her as just the maid now watched with quiet respect. She didn't think about what they had once thought of her. She thought only of the music, and then she played. The sound was deeper, now stronger. Still gentle, still full of heart, but now wrapped in confidence. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about sharing everything. The hurt, the hope. The steps taken in silence. The notes played in the dark. When she finished, she didn't wait for applause. She just stood, bowed her head, and let the silence speak. Then came the clapping, not loud, not forced. It rose like waves, steady, warm, real. Later that evening, one of the guests approached her and asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" Lena smiled and said, "In between washing dishes and dusting picture frames." The woman blinked, confused, but Lena just nodded politely and walked away. She knew where her music came from. It wasn't from books or lessons. It came from the moments no one saw: the quiet ones, the hard ones, the lonely ones. And now, she had finally turned those moments into something that could be heard. The wind outside the mansion carried a quiet chill. The evening sky was soft, with stars, and the garden lights shimmered like tiny candles in the distance. Lena sat alone in the music room, the gala now over. The last guests had gone. The noise had faded, and all that remained was a peaceful kind of silence. She rested her hands on the piano's surface, eyes closed, breathing slow. She had played here many times now, but tonight felt different, not because of who watched her or what she wore, but because she finally felt free. For years, Lena had worked in silence. She had swept hallways, folded linens, and stayed out of sight. No one had asked her who she was. No one had thought to listen. Until the day she played one soft note. Now months later, she had played in many places, some small, some grand, but it was never about the stage. It was about the people. The way a song made a room feel full, even in silence. The way it reminded someone of a moment they thought they forgot. She opened her notebook and began writing. Not music, not notes, just thoughts. Lines that had floated through her mind during quiet nights. I used to think my story didn't matter, but music showed me otherwise. Even the softest sound can shake the heaviest silence. Behind her, quiet footsteps approached. It was Mr. Arlington, holding 2 cups of tea. "I figured you might still be here," he said, placing one on the piano bench beside her. She nodded, offering a small smile. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Too much to think about." He sat down nearby, not saying much, just letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. Finally, he spoke. "You changed more than this house." "You know," Lena looked over, curious. "I've hosted 100 events," he continued, "but no one's ever stopped a room the way you did. You didn't need lights or titles, just truth." She looked down at her hands. The same ones that had once been rough from scrubbing and polishing. Now they played songs, held stories, changed lives, slowly, gently. "I didn't expect all of this," she said quietly. "I just missed the piano." Mr. Arlington nodded. "Sometimes, the things we miss are the things that guide us back to who we really are." The next day, Lena packed her small bag again. She wasn't leaving forever, just traveling to the next place that needed her music. She had been invited to a school in another city where children had never touched a real piano before. They didn't want her as a guest performer. They wanted her as a mentor, someone who could sit with them, teach them how to press each key, and remind them that even broken notes still matter. As she walked out the front door of the mansion, the staff waved goodbye. Some held back tears. Some clapped softly. They all knew she wasn't just the maid anymore. She was part of something bigger now. Herself on the train, Lena sat by the window and watched the fields roll by. Her small bag sat on her lap. Inside, her sheet music and notebook rested carefully folded. She didn't know what the next town would be like. She didn't know if the piano at the school would be in tune, but she wasn't afraid. She had learned that people didn't need perfect. They needed real, and she had plenty of that to give. When the train stopped and she stepped out onto the platform, a group of children stood holding a cardboard sign. It read, "Welcome Miss Lena, our piano angel." She chuckled softly and waved, a bit embarrassed but touched. They led her to a small classroom where an old upright piano waited in the corner. It looked tired, just like the one she had learned on as a child. She sat down, let her fingers rest on the keys, and smiled. One of the kids asked, "Are you famous?" Lena shook her head. "I'm just someone who remembers how music made me feel when no one else could." Then she played not a full song, just a few quiet notes. But the children watched, still and wide-eyed. That was enough. Years later, people would still tell the story of the maid who played one note and made the rich forget how to breathe. But Lena didn't think of herself that way. To her, she was just a girl who had something to say, and music helped her say it, everywhere she went. Someone listened, sometimes with applause, sometimes with silence, but always with heart. And that, she knew, was the best kind of stage there was. The next morning, Lena didn't expect anything to be different. She tied her apron the same way, brushed her hair back the same way. She walked into the grand hallway, ready to clean the stair railing and mop the floors just like every other day. But something felt off, not in a bad way, just strange. The house was too quiet, and when she walked into the main room, One of the butlers actually looked her in the eye. "Mr. Arlington wants to see you in the piano room," he said, almost gently. Lena froze, unsure if she had done something wrong. She thought maybe she had overstepped. Maybe she shouldn't have touched the piano after all. But still, she nodded and walked down the hall. Her hands were cold again, like they had been before she played that first note. Mr. Arlington was standing near the window, sunlight spilling across the piano's polished lid. He didn't look angry, just thoughtful. When he saw her enter, he gave a small nod and said, "Sit." Lena obeyed, nervous, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I didn't know you could play like that," he said, not smiling, just watching. She didn't know what to say. "I don't usually," she replied quietly. He didn't laugh or brush her off like the guest did the night before. Instead, he stepped closer to the piano and said, "Play something, anything." Lena blinked, confused. Was this a test? A trick? Still, she nodded and slowly placed her fingers on the keys. This time she chose something soft, something old, the kind of melody that made people close their eyes. She didn't play to impress him. She played like she always did, from memory, from heart, and again, the room filled with a stillness that wasn't empty. It was full of emotion that didn't need words. When she finished, Mr. Arlington stayed quiet for a long time. Then he finally spoke. "There's a charity event in 2 weeks. We host it every year. There'll be music, speeches. Would you be willing to perform something there?" Lena stared at him, her heart racing. She had never performed in front of anyone, except those few guests the night before. "I'm not a real pianist," she said softly. He shook his head. "You're more real than most." She didn't say yes right away. She told him she needed time to think, and he respected that, something she wasn't used to. As she walked out of the room, her mind was spinning. Could she really play in front of a crowd like that? In the staff quarters, the whispers had already begun. People were talking about her performance, about how the guests clapped, about how the Arlingtons looked at her differently now. One of the older maids said, "That piano must have been waiting for someone like you." Lena smiled a little but stayed quiet. She didn't like too much attention. She just liked the feeling of playing again. That night, in her tiny room, she unfolded the old sheet of music she always kept in her pocket. It was worn now, the corners torn. But the notes were still clear. She placed it on the windowsill, sat on the edge of her bed, and closed her eyes. She played the song in her mind, hearing each note in the silence, and something inside her whispered, "Maybe it's time." The next morning, she found Mr. Arlington in his study and said quietly, "I'll do it." He looked up from his desk and gave a single nod. "Good," he said. "We'll get someone to help you prepare." True to his word, the following day a woman named Miss Keller arrived, a piano coach, calm and patient. She didn't ask why a maid was being trained for a performance. She only asked, "What do you want to play?" And Lena showed her the worn sheet music, the same piece she had carried for years. Ms. Keller studied it, then said, "That's a beautiful piece. Not easy, though." Lena nodded. "It's the only one I've ever wanted to finish." For the next week, Lena cleaned during the day and practiced at night. The staff grew used to hearing soft piano sounds coming from the music room after hours. The guests didn't know who was playing, but some said, "That music feels like something I've missed all my life." One night, while Lena was practicing, Mrs. Arlington entered the room. She didn't say anything, just stood quietly behind her. When Lena finished, she turned and stood quickly. But Mrs. Arlington just gave a small smile and said, "That was lovely." Then she left without another word. And somehow, that small moment meant more than any applause. As the night of the event approached, Lena felt both excited and terrified. She had always been in the background, always behind the scenes, but now, for the first time in her life, she was stepping forward, not as a maid, not as someone forgotten, but as someone who had something to say, not with words, but with music, and deep down, she knew that one note had opened a door she never thought she'd walk through again. The night of the charity event arrived. The Arlington mansion had never looked so grand. Twinkling lights wrapped around the columns. Tables were covered in silver cloth, and soft music played from hidden speakers. Guests stepped out of black cars in silk dresses and sharp suits. They came to donate, to be seen, and to enjoy whatever the Arlingtons had planned for the night. In the music room, Lena stood near the back wall, her hands folded in front of her. She wore a simple blue dress, not fancy, not expensive, but new. It had been picked out by one of the housekeepers who whispered, "You should feel like you belong tonight." Lena wasn't used to wearing anything other than her work uniform now. With her hair neatly tied back and her fingers free of dust and cleaning cloths, she looked different. Still her, but the version she thought the world had forgotten. The piano sat in the center of the hall, lit by a soft spotlight. Beside it stood a tall white card with gold letters that read, "Live Piano Performance, Miss Lena." Some guests noticed it and raised their brows. "Who is Lena?" One asked. "The new young talent?" Asked another. Mr. Arlington simply smiled and said, "Just wait." Backstage, Lena took a slow breath. She could hear the low hum of voices from the hall. She felt her legs go cold and her hands start to shake. It wasn't fear of the piano. It was fear of all those eyes. She had spent years trying not to be noticed, and now, every part of her was about to be seen. Miss Keller, the coach who had helped her prepare, touched her shoulder gently. "You don't need to prove anything," she said. "Just share it." Lena nodded. That sentence felt like the truth. She wasn't here to impress them. She was here to tell a story, one that had been sitting in her chest since childhood. When her name was announced, the room quieted. Lena stepped out slowly, each footstep feeling like it echoed. She didn't look at the crowd, not yet. She sat down at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. She closed her eyes, blocking out the whispers, the stares, the nerves, and then she played. The first note rang soft and true. It felt like home, like rain on a warm roof, like a voice humming in the dark. She played slowly, letting each note breathe. Her fingers moved with care, never rushing, never trying to shine. She wasn't showing off. She was remembering. As the music filled the room, something shifted. People stopped chewing, stopped sipping their wine. One guest leaned forward. Another lowered her head and closed her eyes. They didn't know the name of the piece, but somehow it felt like they had known it their whole lives. It was not a song of glory or riches. It was simple, honest, full of something real. The melody rose gently, then dipped into sadness. It told the story of a girl who once had dreams, who lost them, then found a little peace again. It told of a mother's smile, of quiet nights, of hope held tightly in two small hands. And even though there were no words, the music said everything. Mrs. Arlington, seated near the front, felt a lump rise in her throat. She didn't know why, but something about the music made her chest ache in a way she hadn't felt in years. Even Mr. Arlington, a man who rarely showed emotion, kept his eyes fixed on the keys. The staff stood near the back wall, silent, amazed. The girl they had worked beside all this time was glowing, not from lights, not from makeup, but from truth. When Lena played the final note, the silence that followed felt like the air had been pulled from the room. She lifted her hands slowly and let them rest in her lap. She opened her eyes, and for a moment, no one moved, and then applause. Not the soft kind people give just to be polite. This was deep, full, rising like a wave. It rolled through the room, loud and long. Some stood, some clapped through tears, and Lena just sat there, unsure what to do. She stood, gave a small bow, and quietly walked back behind the curtain. Her heart was still pounding, her cheeks flushed, but she had done it. She had finally shared what she had been holding for so long. Backstage, Miss Keller hugged her gently. "You didn't play music tonight," she whispered. "You gave them something they didn't know they needed." That night, Lena sat alone in her small room, dress folded neatly beside her. She looked at her hands and smiled. They weren't Maid's hands anymore. They were hands that told stories, and people had listened. And outside, under the stars, The world felt just a little different, not because Lena had changed it, but because she had finally let it hear her.